Mary wrote a piece called Real American Heroes, Hugh Thompson and the My Lai Massacre. I highly commend that to your attention. It's on the table out there. Mary will be talking about that tomorrow at the Cost panel, along with our chapter member Richard Hudgens and also the Asians Massacre. And so, welcome on behalf of Veterans for Peace, the Matheson Museum. Let's give the Matheson Museum a warm round of applause for hosting. And Matheson is a tremendous resource for this community. We're just so grateful for their support, for hosting the exhibit, and providing us this beautiful space to think about 50 years on, both the American War in Vietnam, specifically the My Lai Massacre. Today our panel is going to be talking about the massacre, talking about the exhibit, talking about kind of where we are now, where do we go from here in terms of war. What we're going to do is, the three of us are going to speak for, I think, about like 10 minutes each, and then we're going to open it for questions. So if you don't mind holding your questions to the end, it's really going to be, as panels go, a fairly short panel. But the order that we're going to go in, Mac Devitt, who actually brings us this exhibit, please give him a warm round of applause. Mac is going to speak first, and then Camille Scott is the chair of Local Gainesville Veterans for Peace. Will go next. Thank you, Scott. And then I'll kind of wrap up, and I have a handout because, as David Chalmers can tell you, as a history professor, we feel naked if we don't have handouts to give to people. So I'll hand that out at the appropriate time. So, Matt, can you take it away?
Sure. I'm going to stand up. There's always the A students in the front of the room, and then maybe the C and D students in the back of the room. And I want to make sure to reach you all, because often you're neglected when you sit in the back. I was thinking about what to talk about around My Lai, and I was lying in bed this morning staring at the ceiling. And I also want to just caution you, I get emotional talking about this. I've been sort of immersed in trying to understand, in Vietnam, what was it like for the people who are on the other side of our guns? We're as a culture, things can be all about us. And in Vietnam, often it's all about our veterans. Because those are the people we understand. They're part of our tribe, they're part of our culture. And we can see their pain and we can understand their pain a whole lot better than we can understand the pain of people who were farmers, who were simple people. People who, I heard people talking about how many photos they had. Hundreds, some of the veterans, hundreds of photos from Vietnam. And yet here were people, and there's very little photographic record. So in struggling to do this, I learned some things about us and about the people who lived there, and about trying to understand their situation. One thing that really struck me is that most people who went to Vietnam, most veterans, they did it here, some did a little longer. These folks lived for 10 years in the war zone. I focused on the folks up in those northern provinces where there was a lot of sympathy for the Viet Cong, and there was a whole lot of fighting in that area. And the other thing I thought about was these were people who were risking everything just to live there, because a veteran could come back severely wounded, but his house would still be there. Hopefully his partner would still be there, his kids would still be there. But these folks were dealing all the time, living in that war zone, with losing their houses. And even words like houses, we call them hooches. Well, for the Vietnamese, the house was a really sacred place. There were multiple altars in there to ancestors and to certain natural goddesses. So what we would call a hooch was somebody's house. And then the other thing is these villages. It took a number of generations to become really part of a village. They were incredibly constructed. Each one was kind of like a fortress. It helped them during the years when the Chinese were invaded to hold off the Chinese. It was an elaborate communal structure, elaborate waterworks that took hundreds of years to construct and make just right. And we could go in there with a bulldozer. And the big banyan tree that was by the gate, where there was a little tea cellar and whatever, it'd sell tea and people would sit in that shade. And the gates would be locked at night. That kind of stuff. We could just take our bulldozer and go through that. We'd cut that tree down. And I tried to find pictures of what these villages were like before the Americans came. And they're almost impossible to find, even local tourist pictures. You can get the ones up in the highlands of the dry rice agriculture. But most of those villages in those northern provinces are gone, as near as I could tell. Just about gone. So we went in there in trying to deny a resource to the enemy, and we just wiped out. It's like when we think about environmental degradation and damage, this was like social and cultural. Just wipe them out. And we could say, well, these people, they just make these little houses, they could live anywhere. But this was, so then we come to My Lai. And what is it, 504 people died. And then so you think about that, that's a lot. And then you think that 24 families were completely wiped out. Grandparents, parents, and children. Now these are people who were really invested in family. That was your connection, was where you were in your family and your connection with family. And then, of course, when we wipe out that many people, there are some people who are lucky enough to survive, but most of them were just destitute. They would wander around. Some of the survivors almost turned into beggars, the children and whatever, because there were so little resources to help them. And sometimes they'd lost all this extended family. So, and then the other problem that I learned about is that they had no experience with how do you recognize, memorialize all these children who had died. They were good at memorializing ancestors, but these children weren't ancestors. So that just really made things difficult. It's only in the last 10 or 20 years that some of those families have been reclaiming those children because they're old enough now to have been ancestors. And they're actually going back and getting bodies and doing their burial rituals and putting them in the right cemeteries and putting altars up. So the devastation is just kind of amazing in that. And then, I don't want to take more than my time. And then here's another thing to think about. When they talk about their losses when the Americans came, it often sounds kind of stilted. The language is different. There was a thing in Vietnam where you couldn't really talk about yourself, your pain, your anguish. Culturally, you just didn't do that. And I remember hearing a story about a family who lived in an apartment building in Hanoi, and after the war, all their children came home. None of them had died. They couldn't celebrate because all around them, people had lost children who had gone off to war and people from the bomb. So one way to try and understand these people is through Westerners who were there, who managed to get close. And one person was Lady Borton. You know about Lady Borton? So she was an aid worker, we've got her book out there on the resource table. Her book is called After Sorrow. And she basically got to know these folks when she was there. She then followed up with them year after year after year, went back to Vietnam, got to know these women, got to be down in the Mekong Delta, falling asleep, with Uncle, the older guy in the family and the children. And they started talking to her about what it was like to be in the war. They talked about their pride, how they tricked the Americans, they tricked the South Vietnamese soldiers. They would hide arms under these vats of fish sauce that just stank, But it took her years to be able to really understand what their experience was like. And this was a kicker. When one woman had sores on her legs from Agent Orange, she had forgotten to wash off with urine after she went into one of the rice paddies. And so this researcher was getting that story, getting the story about Agent Orange and what happened and whatever, but Lady Borton realized she wasn't telling him the whole story. And she said afterwards, after he left, why didn't you tell him the rest of what happened to you, And she said, he was so sad. I didn't want to make him sadder. There's this sensitivity about other people's feelings. One last thing. Our anti-war movement was really important. I think the Vietnamese who were fighting us, it was their way of saying, it's not the people of the United States aren't to blame for this, the government's to blame. Even they had a hard time blaming soldiers sometimes because it was the government that was to blame. Our government was to blame. But when the war ended and we took our troops out, as near as I can tell, pretty much our anti-war movement just deflated like a basketball that wouldn't bounce anymore. And for the Vietnamese, they still lost a lot of troops, a lot of civilians. And then we left the country devastated. Just like when we went out of Vietnam, we left My Lai, we'd go in there and we killed all these people. They had to come down from the hills, the VC battalion, and the family members that survived, and they had to decide how to bury in mass graves those people. We had this way of just doing stuff and just leaving a mess behind because we weren't trying to hold on to territory. Just doing body counts and killing people. So the same thing happened at the end of the war. We had an economic embargo that had been ongoing, and I think that went on for another 20 years anyway. People couldn't get basic medicines. They had in their environment, they had some typhoons and storms that just did tremendous wreckage. They really needed our help, and I'm responsible for that as well. I was alive at that time, obviously, and but disengaged at that point. They really needed our help. The women that Lady Borton interviewed, there was a time when this one woman said the hardest thing was listening to my child cry at night when she was hungry and I had nothing to give her. So I'm just telling you how hard it has been for me, and then to try and communicate that in the exhibit. Just how big this tragedy was for the people who lived there. And for us to understand that we have our own viewpoint, our own way of looking at things. And it's really difficult for us, even with the best of intentions, to stand in their sandals or stand in their shoes and really understand what it was like. So, thank you.
I think I'm going to sit because I like to be comfortable. So my name's Scott Camille, and I'm the president of Veterans for Peace, and I spent 20 months in Vietnam as a Marine. And what I'm going to be talking about is about what I saw and what I did, and a little bit about the policy. And I want to say that about 1 in 10 veterans that went to Vietnam was actually in combat. And so you could have served a year in Vietnam. Maybe your job might be loading bombs on a plane. You don't see the people those bombs kill. You sleep in air-conditioned barracks. You never see a friend killed. You never see a dead Vietnamese. And you come home and say, hey, the war wasn't so bad. And I don't like getting this rap about all these bad things. We didn't do these bad things. So the majority of people that went to Vietnam did not see these things. They did not see anybody being killed, American or Vietnamese. And so when you talk to a Vietnam veteran, important things to know about is what branch of service they were in, what was their job, and that helps, and what year they were there, and that helped put in perspective the things that they're going to say. So I was in Vietnam. The Marines landed in Vietnam in September of '65. I got there in March of '66, and I thought, we're going to kick their ass. The war's going to be over in 6 months. We're all going to go home. And everybody in my unit had volunteered for the Marine Corps, and everybody in my unit had volunteered for Vietnam. And let's say that instead of being there at the beginning, I came near the end, and I saw that, well, we're winding down. We're not in this fight anymore. We're winding down. Like how would it be? Like, I can't imagine being in a war where it's not all-out war, where we're winding down, and it's just would be really odd for me to think of that. The official policy in Vietnam is what happened in My Lai is a result of official policy in Vietnam. And that official policy, I call it three-legged policy. The way that we measured success was by body count. Body count was official policy. I didn't make that up. Americans like to win, and look at baseball and basketball and football, and everybody's trying to run up the score. You want that high score. Well, we wanted the high score. And we were taught that if we kill 10 Vietnamese for every American that dies, we're going to win. So we're out there getting that score. And when you measure success by dead human beings, bodies start stacking up of dead human beings. And the official policy of measuring success by how many dead people you can stack up is U.S. policy. That policy was carried out in areas called free fire zones. I worked in free fire zones. We were taught that the war we were fighting was a guerrilla war, and that the enemy that's fighting you gets their support from the people in the countryside. And the people in the countryside are going to give them food, they're going to give them water, they're going to hide them, they're going to fix them when they're wounded, and give them intelligence information. And so we needed to knock out that support system, and that was the people. And the free fire zones, we were taught, all those people were warned that they had to leave, and the people that stayed were there to stay to help the enemy. So I wanted to get high body count, and I believed all the people that I encountered were the enemy. And it didn't really matter to me if it was a man or a woman or how old the person was. We could have a patrol and walk through a village, and a 6-year-old kid would be able to tell the Viet Cong how many Americans came through the village, which the way they went. So in my mind, anybody that can hurt us is the enemy. This is a free fire zone. Kill them. And that's what I did. And the method of operation in those free fire zones was called search and destroy. Official policy, search and destroy. Search out the enemy, destroy. And we also threw dead bodies in the wells so there'd be no water for them to drink. We burned the crops. We wanted to make it where this area here, they can no longer operate because there's no support for them. I feel that Lieutenant Cali was scapegoated. After World War II, we had the Nuremberg trials, we had the trials in Japan, and soldiers who said, I was just following orders. We said, you should disobey an unlawful order. We executed people. We executed a general named Yamashita who was on an island 1,000 miles away from where his troops were. His troops committed atrocities. We hung him. And we said he was responsible for their training. He was responsible for their action. So with all of those precedents that we set in Japan and Nuremberg, how come it didn't go up the chain of command for Lieutenant Cali? Why did everybody else get off? Our policy isn't an honest policy. We use what we want to punish others when they do something wrong, but when we do it, we just ignore that policy. I called up the Pentagon way years later after Vietnam, and I told them that I was a Vietnam veteran, and that in my training, I was taught that it was my duty and my responsibility to disobey an unlawful order, but that I was never taught how to recognize an unlawful order, and I was never taught the process for disobeying an unlawful order. And I asked them, how does one recognize an unlawful order, and what is the process for refusing an unlawful order? And the Pentagon Legal Department said to me that all orders are considered lawful, that they don't consider a such thing as an unlawful order. All orders are lawful. So they use it to try to get out of being in trouble for doing it, but in fact, it's official U.S. policy. Concerning the people that died at My Lai, our culture has a strange way of looking at things. So let's say that Lieutenant Cali was a B-52 pilot, and he flew over My Lai, and he dropped bombs, and he killed the same exact number of people, the same individuals, and they're dead. He would have gotten an air medal. You know, we wouldn't have cared about them. We don't care when civilians get killed by drones or by bombs or by artillery. When you shoot them, they don't like that, but you can kill them any other way, and they're just collateral damage. I have a hard time with that kind of policy and with that philosophy. In Nuremberg, they also said that the number one war crime, the top war crime, is starting a war, because from that crime, all other war crimes emanate. So starting a war is the number one war crime. And that's what I want to say, and I'll listen to questions when it's question time. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Matt. As promised, I have a handout. Most of what I'm going to be talking about the American War of Vietnam happens before 1965. But I wanted to just give a brief introduction. Again, my name is Paul Ortiz, member of Gainesville Veterans for Peace. I also teach history at the University of Florida. In the 80s, I was in the 82nd Airborne and then 7th U.S. Special Forces, stationed in Central America. I served in multiple combat zones throughout the region. A lot of people would talk about Vietnam. And even as a fairly ignorant sergeant in Special Forces, I realized pretty early on that really a lot of people in the Reagan administration wanted to use Central America as they would put it, to make up for Vietnam, to cause an incident where more U.S. soldiers could go and invade, there would be boots on the ground, and the U.S. would somehow make up for its loss in Vietnam. And remember, at the very end of the First Gulf War, President Bush kind of jumping and clicking his heels and saying, by God, we whipped the Vietnam syndrome. The idea being that most Americans now were back in the war zone. But this war dehumanization, a case study handout, was something I wrote up last night after watching this amazing film on Winter Soldier and Winter Soldier Heroes. And I put this together because thinking about the testimonies that the men, the veterans, were giving reminded me of a few things. I mean, one is, when we talk about the Cold War, we often talk about, we think we're talking about the U.S. versus the Soviet Union. In reality, most of what happened in the Cold War was about European and US troops either firsthand attacking, invading, or advising and helping others invade nations, take over nations in Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. So one of the first things I mentioned in the War on Dehumanization case study guide is the Vietnamese people had to fight off the Japanese during World War II, then the French came back to try to recolonize them, and Great Britain decided to help the French. So you have a people who are oppressed for decades, even before the American War in Vietnam begins, fighting generation after generation of invasions. In 1946, now Scott mentioned the Nuremberg trials. One of the most worst atrocities that happens after World War II is in 1946, in a number of cities of what becomes Vietnam had protests, nationalist protests. The French colonial power responds by bombing Haiphong, the city near the port, killing 6,000 civilians. I mean, 6,000 people. And that, in many ways, leads to the French reinvasion of what was called French Indochina. The U.S. is fully behind this, by the way. And in the handout, I talk about how in 1953, page 1 is about a famous speech that President Eisenhower gives to the Seattle Governors Conference. And he talks not only about the U.S. supporting the French effort, and by the last few years of the French occupation of what becomes Vietnam, the U.S. is giving about $1 billion per year in military support to the French. Now, back in the 50s, $1 billion is a lot of money. Now it's hardly anything, right? But just imagine this, and so you can read this at your own leisure, but essentially Eisenhower is talking about the reasons why the U.S. is supporting French imperialism in French Indochina. And he talks about things like tungsten, he talks about tin. There were other minerals to think about. So one of the things I want us to think about is the impact of capitalism. These are a series of capitalist wars that the European powers and the U.S. were fighting against nations in the global south. Part of the reason the French have to pull out of Vietnam, in addition to being defeated by the Viet Minh, is that a war in Algeria is heating up. And the French have to decide what part of their empire they're going to hold on to. But the torture techniques that the Europeans, the British, the French, and the Americans use against people of the global south are very similar. How many of you have seen a movie called The Battle for Algiers? Okay, a lot of us have. It's a film which depicts Algerian resistance fighters, and the most powerful sequences are the torture sequences, right? The ways in which the French Foreign Legion, the French secret police torture Algerians who are captured. This type of torture is something that the British used in Kenya, something that we know the US used in Vietnam. The French, all the other European powers, the Dutch, the Belgians, they all used these types of dehumanizing tactics against people. Why? If you flip over the handout, I talk about racism. When we talk about war in the 21st century, we've got to talk about race and racism. And the US, specifically in terms of the invasion of Vietnam, if you think about the preceding 2.5 centuries of US history, so much of our history, a central theme is anti-Asian racism, brutal discrimination against Asian people. The anti-Chinese pogroms in places like Montana or Seattle, Washington, or Tacoma, Washington, or Portland, Oregon, or Northern California, killed thousands of Chinese people. These were pogroms led by, in many cases, US law enforcement. A lot of Americans are ignorant of this history. When they think about lynching, they think about the Southeast. They don't think the anti-Black lynchings, which were horrific. They don't think about anti-Mexican lynchings in the Southwest or the anti-Chinese lynchings out west. The handout, I won't read it verbatim, goes a little further though, because entire states like Oregon, states like Nebraska, virtually outlawed Asian American people from actually owning land. They call these statutes, let me get this right, anti-alien land laws, which made it a crime to sell land to a so-called alien. Well, they didn't even have to mention what kinds of aliens they were talking about. California also had a mining law in the wake of the gold rush, saying that essentially Asian and Mexican people could not stake claims to gold claims, right? So this long history of anti-Asian racism is part of this culture, part of the society, generations before we launched the Vietnam War. And I think it makes it easier for the people in command, people like John Foster Dulles, who actually does want to go to the French with an offer. On the eve of the French defeat in Vietnam, Dulles is advising the president. He's trying to push the US to lend nuclear warheads to the French so that they can hold on to French Indochina. Think about that for a minute. The idea of using nuclear bombs. Well, what other nation does the US use nuclear bombs against in World War II? Germany? Japan, exactly. So I think that race is a very important part of this. Lyndon B. Johnson rises to political prominence in Texas by invoking anti-Asian, anti-Chinese racism. He does this for years and years and years. Donald Trump, during his presidential primary run, I watched some of those speeches he gave out. When he went to California, he claimed that today the government of China trains their children at age 3 to become killers. He said this in a public platform. And I'm watching this and I'm thinking, wow, it's dehumanization over and over again. So as I wrap up, one of the things I want us to think about is how do we deal with this history of racism and capitalism, which pushes us into war over and over again. We have choices that we can make to try to stop this. This is what Veterans for Peace does. And we need more members, by the way. If you don't go to Veterans for Peace meeting now, you're not a member, please join us. Because to be against war in this society, to be against racism, you're already in a minority position. And you can tell this if you go through this exhibit. The fact that these chairs are not packed with people right now, a lot of people live their lives either willfully ignorant or they've been trained to be ignorant of what the US did in Vietnam. When I was growing up, I grew up in a military town. I'm a 3rd generation combat veteran. No one ever told me about these atrocities that had occurred until I got into the military. And then people were like, oh, you didn't know about that? Wow, you're ignorant. But if no one tells you, you just don't know. The last 2 books I'll commend your attention. One I actually stole from Scott Camille. No, I mean I borrowed. If anyone knows Scott knows he has an incredible library. So a book called The Other Side by Stockman and Thomas Hayden. And Mac mentioned the importance of trying to learn from Vietnamese people. What Scott Lynn and Tom Hayden and Herb Athaker, an American communist historian, did in 1965 was to go to Vietnam and to try to learn from people in the National Liberation Front, try to learn from people in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and to try to get their side and try to do something for peace. The other book, which I kind of have mixed feelings about, but I think is more important than ever, is Dispatches by Michael Herb. It's a very important book because he talks about the atrocities. He makes it clear it isn't just My Lai, which was an atrocity, that all war is an atrocity. But it's also important for one reason, which is today, the US government, and this started actually under the Obama administration, it goes even back further, the US government is trying to whitewash what happened during the American invasion of Vietnam. They're trying to say it was a good war. They're trying to do something which Kurt Vonnegut, if he was still alive, would be railing against. And we also wrote up this bibliography about about war and anti-war literature. And one of the things that Kurt Vonnegut said when he was still alive was that the US was trying to turn the American war in Vietnam into World War II, trying to make it a good war, right? And what he said was this: I'm not pure, we are not pure, our nation is not pure. And I insist that the core of the American tragedy, best exemplified by the massacre of civilians at My Lai, is the illusion engendered by World War II, that in the war between good and evil, we are always perfectly naturally on the side of good. This is what makes us so unrestrained in the uses of weaponry. And right now, if you look at the Pentagon homepage, they have a whole site dedicated to so-called remembering the Vietnam War, but in reality, it's just whitewashing the Vietnam War. They're trying to turn the American war in Vietnam into World War II. They have a home front section, what people did back home to support the war. they have a support the troops section, they have all the great technological innovations that came out of the war. They don't mention Agent Orange. They don't mention the ongoing poisoning of people in Vietnam by byproducts of our chemical warfare. So they're trying to whitewash the war, and it's up to us to stand against that historical vision. And I think that this exhibit does a wonderful job. So in conclusion, I just want to thank Maggie again for bringing this to us. And we'll take Q&A.
Questions? Gary?
I'm the first last night, so it's kind of really more of a statement than a question. Maybe I can turn it into one. I was in the anti-war movement. I'm not a veteran of the services. I would venture to say that I was against the war before anybody on the panel. And to me, one of the things about My Lai, one of the important things here in America was putting anti-war journalism front page, and putting the investigative reporter front page. It took some doing. And that in concert with what Daniel Ellsberg did, and then what the Washington Post did, and so on, in beginning to bring out a lot of the truth about the war, I think was very important in terms of being in the American people about what was going on. Obviously, it didn't help the people who had already been killed. The anti-war movement was a lot of different movements. And so after the war ended, obviously part of the agreements that were made in Paris included money to go to the Vietnamese, but that was never lived up to by the United States. Probably the intention was never to live up to that. Ford, when he was president, was making plans to go back into Vietnam at one point because of what was going on over there. Unfortunately, that was shut down. I don't know if people remember that. It was quite insane.
What did he want to do?
He wanted to go back in.
That's unviolent.
Yeah, because they were still trouble. So there were people that were still working to try and end the embargo, normalize relations, and so on. But because the anti-war movement was made up of so many different types of sub-movements, part of which had been in the anti-draft movement, it did deflate. It didn't end, but it did deflate. And then it turned into a variety of other things, whether it was anti-apartheid or anti-nuke or so on and so forth. One of the books I would recommend for everybody to read is David Halberstam's The Best and the Brightest, a powerful book about how supposedly the most intelligent people got us involved in that war. Just a stunning book. And then, to a certain extent, there were anti-war people in the Congress. The Fulbright hearings that were conducted were stark. And I remember sitting in the living room of a friend of mine as they were on television, and my friend's father was cursing Fulbright for being a communist, for even questioning that the war continued, and questioning this general for how much the war was going to cost in conducting the war. I don't think we can underestimate communism.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Yeah,
I'd like to hear from the panel.
Right. I don't think,
Let him finish.
well, let me just finish it up. I don't think we can underestimate communism as a reason for getting involved. And I'd like a response to that, in addition to what you were saying about racism.
So I'm curious if anybody on the panel has looked at the Truth and Reconciliation movement. We've been studying it during Black History Month in my church, and Commissioner Hutchinson came and spoke about it. And I know that the new museum in Montgomery has opened, and that's kind of its focus. Do you see this as working for us to work our way through the racist capitalist system that we're in? Do you see this as something that might be useful to to connect with this My Lai and Vietnam experience?
Sorry, communism question, do you want to do that?
You want to do communism first?
Well, yeah, I mean, so I made comments about the Cold War, and again, I think as a historian, I would say very strongly that we are taught in the U.S. a certain version of Cold War, East versus West. One of the things when I went into the military in '82, there was what was called the folding gap scenario. It was the idea that the Soviet Union was going to send tanks through a corridor and actually invade Western Europe. I learned early on that was a sham. It was a myth. It was something used to control the American public. In fact, the number one duty station that you desired as a GI was Western Germany. People begged to go to Western Germany because they knew that the Soviets weren't going to invade there. But we did know, where I was sent, Central America, was we were told a couple things. One was, you're there to stop a Castro-style revolution. You're there to spread democracy. And I didn't realize this in the beginning, but certainly processing this towards the end, I realized, again, those were myths designed to control me, designed to get me to do things I shouldn't really be doing. In terms of Vietnam specifically, we really owe it to the Soviet Union and to the Brits that the U.S. didn't use nuclear devices in French Indochina in 1953, because it was the Soviets and the Brits who essentially went to the French and said, we've got to kind of stave this off. So, yeah, I'm not denying the importance of communism, just saying that from the U.S. side, communism is often used, and it still is used. I mean, today, President Trump is on television talking about the Democrats want socialism. And so that's how he's going to manipulate us into supporting him. So we just have to be kind of careful how we vote those things.
So Mary, that whole idea of truth and reconciliation, I think is really powerful. Our chapter of Veterans for Peace is a member of the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. Ring a bell for anybody? They call it just Sites of Conscience. It's worth looking it up online. It's over 200 sites worldwide where social injustices have happened of some kind that have been disasters for people. And they have, this is not quite truth and reconciliation, but the formula that I use in the exhibit comes from their program ideas, which basically is, it's important to remember and honor the folks who suffered. Then it's important to engage people in dialogue, in conversation, and they'll do this, some of their sites are active truth and reconciliation kind of sites. And then the last thing is to help people make a renewed commitment to social justice and peace in some form. So that's a really powerful kind of way to go about it. But when you said this, I thought about, is that something that we could ever do in the United States the way we're structured? I think we could do it around racism. But for us to really take risk, I was in the Netherlands and I went to the Maritime Museum and I went down in the bottom of one of these East India ships and there's a little video playing and it said about all the horrible things that the Dutch did to the colonies. To extract nutmeg and the oppression and whatever. And then they said, we as a nation give more money per capita to this area of the world, more donations than any other country. And we're really trying to amend for what we did. And one of the reasons I did this exhibit is I used to say to my friends, before I die, I'd like to see like something in Washington to the victims of all our wars, But it seems to me that our country is so locked in that in terms of our mindset, that it would be very difficult for us to own many of these social injustices. And I'd be interested in conversation afterwards or whatever with people and what they think. Are we capable of that?
I would agree that we're not. This country is not, because it's a fundamental challenge to the system. Because the system is based on these kinds of imperialist wars with the ultimate objective they could use communism or fundamentalist Islam. It doesn't matter. The key to American foreign policy has been since World War II, fundamentally, and it's taken up from the British and the French and other colonial powers of Europe. It's to make the world safe for corporate capital, and it uses military force when necessary. It uses coercion, manipulation of elections. I mean, dating back, you mentioned our bands in Guatemala, you mentioned Mossadegh and Iran in your little handout. I mean, it's always an intervention, whether it's a direct military intervention or in some manner undercutting democratic processes, because our bands, for instance, using a case dating back to the 50s, was democratically elected. Similarly, Salvador Allende was democratically elected in Chile in 1971, and he was overthrown. So it's either there are multiple tools that can be used, but the fundamental aim of American foreign policy is to maintain a system where corporate capital is safe, protected, and their interests are paramount, and everyone else plays a secondary role. The role of ideology in this country is so markedly powerful. Corporate media, the education system, all with close links to powerful economic interests. So I agree with Mac. I don't think we can. I think we can fundamentally dig down deep into what the bases of many of these military interventions are about. And yes, there are elements of racism, but fundamentally it's making the world safe for capital.
Right. I have one glimmer of hope. And now I just thought about this, but Canada's been doing a lot of this. They've been apologizing. I don't know if you know about this, to Native peoples. Trudeau has had public apologies. I almost can't imagine that happening in this climate in the United States, but that would be probably the way to start, would be to see what we are as what government officials, what are willing to apologize for what we've done, even in these smaller ways.
Well, they won't, because they call that the apology tour, and the second that word comes out of anyone's mouth, that's what they'll say.
Right, but maybe that's an attitude thing, maybe we can change that. So I'm gonna stop talking about this.
Well, maybe we need to have a culture of apology, though, because I mean, one of the things that gives us hope is, I mean, oftentimes when you talk about war in the US, and I've learned this because I've talked about this in other countries, but the US is unique in the sense that people begin to use the human nature argument almost immediately. They'll say, well, it's just human nature to wage war on other people. Most people in the world don't have that opinion, because that, again, it's the ideology of human nature in this country is taught in such a way that, oh, humans are naturally aggressive. Most people throughout the world are not taught that ideology, because a very few minority of nations in this world have invaded and occupied and destroyed other nations. Now, ironically, that's something we can take hope from, right? But then again, we have to realize, well, what do we do here about our own behaviors? We're always talking about other people's behaviors, right? But what do we talk? How can we talk about our own? That seems to be part of this. Going back to Mary, what you're talking about.
Matt, could you repeat the International Coalition
Of Sites of Conscience.
SITES?
Yes. So if you just look up Sites of Conscience.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, very powerful group.
So when we were doing the peace vigil Tuesday night, who made signs, hands off Venezuela, it's really hard to explain to young people who came up and were aggressively yelling at me, you know, Veterans for Peace, we don't believe in war, we don't believe that's the answer. You know, he just said we were left, I mean, he's like, we don't know what's going on there, and just was screaming.
Was he planning to fight? You've been a veteran, probably.
No, I haven't.
Well, anyway.
So I don't know, I mean, I just see the US is gonna continue to be interventionist warmongers.
Well, think about where they attacked you at. It's at a vigil that Pugh has been organizing. I mean, how many years has that been
15,
organizing?
this is our 15th year.
So 15 years, and one of the things, periodically, people have driven cars in there, and a lot of things, but that bearing witness, even against all odds to me, is really, at this point, what matters. It's what we can do. I remember coming back from Central America in '86 and agonizing over what I had taken part in. And the genocide, and it was a genocide. It's very important to understand that what the U.S. made possible in Central America and Guatemala and other nations was a genocide. Hundreds of thousands of people fleeing from villages, including Venezuela. I was actually stationed in Venezuela for a while. But when I came back to the U.S., and I guess this is another hopeful thing, is one of the first things that I got involved in was the sanctuary movement. The sanctuary movement took its cue as a faith-based movement from the anti-slavery movement, right? And saying that we caused this mess in Central America. We have a moral responsibility to take people in who are fleeing from these burned out towns and regions. I think actually several of us in this room participated in the sanctuary movement. And it didn't stop the wars, but again, the thing I think of with the young people is, this is kind of embarrassing for me to admit this, but I didn't know there was such a thing as an anti-war movement until almost the day I left the military in Central America. And I remember on my way back to the US reading this news item, and it said that this guy called Jesse Jackson was in Mexico with Central American nations trying to stop the war. They were stop the wars in Central America, and I thought, what is this? I mean, I grew up in a military town. We had no history of any anti-war thing. Then I found out Scott Camille and members of Veterans for Peace had actually been in Central America doing truth-telling commissions, right? But again, if I put myself in their shoes about the same age, I wouldn't have known any of that, because I'm raised in what Dr. King called the most violent nation on the face of the earth, and we still are. So going against that, but stage one is bearing witness. I mean, we're out there in the corner, and sometimes you've been by yourself.
I have several run-ins with reactionaries, but mostly most of the people are discreet, express their views, sentiments, and in overall, there's more positive thumbs up and humps supportive of our activity than reactionaries, and especially the really hostile ones I feel. Some of them can broke up our signs and try to punch us and that kind of stuff.
That hasn't happened in a long time. They would try to run us down.
It's been a while.
Yeah, they used to do that. There was a big road sign at Oaks Mall. I don't know if it's still down. It was somebody drove a truck and tried to hit one of us and miss it and run down the road sign.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, there.
I guess to start off, it's been 10 years since my last deployment to Iraq, but when I come back for mid-tour leave, there was a lot of praise on it. Oh, thank you so much for what you're doing, and I've noticed there's kind of been a shift. I've never heard a story of a Vietnam vet coming home and people thanking them for what they've done and all the sacrifices they've made. But now soldiers are kind of hero worshipped. They're a superhero, and it's just weird to me to see that narrative change. And I know my experience speaking to even other veterans, if you criticize the war movement, or you criticize the wars that are going on, then you were a garbage soldier. If you criticize it while you're in, then you're a problem soldier. There's never a good time to criticize it as a modern veteran, and it's just, to me, it's very odd to see that transition from Vietnam veterans being demonized to where we are at now, and soldiers are placed on a really big pedestal for what's a low entry job at the end of the day. And I just was wondering if the panel sees that changing or what may have caused that.
You should answer.
Well, I think that we didn't win our war, And we came home and we were whistleblowers. And I think that they want to neutralize that kind of activity. And the best way to neutralize that activity is to make heroes out of you guys.
So I have something to just sort of thought about that too, is I think the way that the American public has been gotten by the short hairs on this stuff is this whole idea of the war on terror. The idea that we were attacked, that our borders are not safe, that this could happen again, and that it's okay to do anything at all to keep that from happening. And so what happens is that they've been able to link our security as a nation, our safety, with these foreign adventures. Now, that didn't happen in Vietnam. We weren't worried about the Vietnamese planting bombs somewhere in this country. So I think as we've bought as a nation into that idea, that then all of a sudden we sort of glorify soldiers in this way, and if you attack the military or whatever, well, you're making us insecure in some kind of way. And just want to say one thing. There's a book called The German War, and it's this guy has done an extensive study of German civilians during World War II. And he actually takes letters longitudinally through the length of the war that families exchanged with soldiers and back and forth and all these different stories. And his question is really, how come the German people didn't turn against Hitler? How come they all stayed in line? They all stayed unified until almost the very, very end. And it's fascinating in the sense that Hitler was able to frame the danger in the same way. That the Bolsheviks from the outside, the Jews from the inside, were really out to destroy the country. And they had to, and then once they had done these things to the Jews that everybody was aware of, God forbid that they should lose the war and the Jews would come back, because then things were really going to get bad for everybody. So somehow we bought into this national identity of people under threat. And it's okay to do anything, anywhere, to keep that from happening.
So I want to say that by putting the soldier on the pedestal is when people attack the policy, they make it seem like we're attacking the soldiers. And it makes it harder to attack the policy when you wrap that terrible policy with soldiers, because people don't want to attack the soldiers.
Well, they also, speaking of neutralizing, the government's different things that they want to neutralize, well, the press in the Vietnam War came out and showed what was going on at some point, and then when we had the war on terror, we embedded our press with over there to where they're practically becoming part of the governmental report instead of independent press. And so that was, there's probably a couple other things I was going to say, but I think I forgot.
These are important. Pearson.
I was talking to somebody last night who had been to Vietnam not too long ago and said that A, there are hardly any people alive there now who remember the war firsthand, and B, they all have a very positive image of Americans and are very friendly and supportive. And I was confused by that because it's Americans that are famous for historical amnesia, and Asians in particular are famous for historical consciousness and remembering things in a very long-term context. I'm still confused about that because, after all, you can run into American Southerners today who hate Yankees. But why and how do you turn around this time that the Vietnamese are the ones to forgive and forget?
Well, when I'm not the best person to answer that, but when Stoughton Lynn, reading this book, The Other Side, when Stoughton and Herb Aptheker and Tom Hayden traveled throughout North Vietnam especially. But even when they met with people from the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and other parts of the world, there was such faith that people in Vietnam put in the U.S. anti-war movement. I mean, they talked, and this is 65, this is before they were, and in fact, I think to this day, I could be wrong about this, but there's a street named after Norman Morrison.
After what?
Norman Morrison was the man who went and set himself on fire at the Pentagon. And he was a national hero. When Lind and Aptheker traveled and Tom Hayden to North Vietnam, I mean, people had written songs about him. Everywhere those three Americans went, people said, thank you for the anti-war movement. This is in 65. And
Where was that street? Was it in Vietnam?
It's in,
Okay,
but I don't know what.
No, that's all I wondered.
But yeah, there's the Ballad of Norman Morrison, and everywhere they went, people would sing this song for them, and they had learned it, and they would say the things that we kind of alluded to, which is that, we understand the difference between you Americans and your government. We feel that you're fundamentally good, but we feel your government is. They knew what Johnson had said about them. They knew what Eisenhower had said about them.
So Paul, the other thing is that they won. I mean, that was huge for them and huge for other small countries. And I remember reading that when they defeated the Chinese, they wanted to make sure they didn't lose face, the Chinese. And so they went with all these gifts and strew flowers for the emperor, and they did a whole bunch of other things in their delegation because they feel bad for people who lost. So I think that's one thing. They're being nice to us. But I think another thing is things did not get very much better for them after the war. They had their country, but it was devastated. And they had famines, and they had shortages, and people were leaving in droves. They finally had that orderly entry, leave the country program. I forget what it was called. They finally got sort of that together. And they're very entrepreneurial people, and they're opportunistic, and they're survivors. And I think they would be just as difficult if we tried to in any way really take over. And capitalism to some extent has changed their lives there, not always for the good. But I think that they're really thinking, why not? We beat you once, I think they have that. I'm speculating about a lot of this. But I think when you win against the United States, it's a very different feeling than when you feel like you've been crushed.
Back to Doug's point about the Iraq and Afghan wars, the modern wars, it seems like a profound change since Vietnam is the volunteer army, volunteer services, rather than the draft, populating the fighting forces. And that's got to have an effect on, and conversations I've had suggest it cuts both ways. One is we're proud of you for volunteering, and the other sentiment that sometimes expresses, is this the best you could do for yourself as enlist in the army?
Right.
And so I don't know what the panel might say about, but it seems like that's a profound enough shift that would have had impact on the way that the home front receives the veterans coming back from war now versus right after Vietnam.
So when we had the war in Vietnam going on, there was a draft. And that meant that everybody who, grandmothers, aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, everybody who knew and was related to somebody in that age range that were possibly be drafted, they didn't want that happen to their kids, their friends, their husband, their wife, their brother, their sister. And so they had something at stake to fight about. Today, it's an all-volunteer army. And the only people who really care, well, it's not really the only people, but the majority of the people who are concerned are the families of those guys that are serving. And they're a small pot. So there's a small amount of families that are concerned. And so, I think that bringing back the draft would be a great idea. Because then people would have to think about what our policy is, because they would actually have something at risk.
But it's a larger group of the population that are praising and worshiping, putting on pedestals those returning soldiers than just the families of returning soldiers.
I think there's an element of guilt. I mean, I was one of the first generation of the so-called volunteer army. To me, it didn't seem like much of a volunteer thing, because where I grew up, like I said, it was all military, heavily decaying industrial town. Joining the army was a way to get out of this. Excuse me.
Like a poverty trap.
Yeah, it was a poverty trap.
Poverty trap.
I feel like a lot of now, of course, being a university professor and traveling a lot, I think there's a lot of guilt among kind of upper middle class bourgeois people who say they support the troops because they're like, well, my kid's not a troop, and thank God for that, right? And so, but there's class within even the military. So there's officers. So like I talked to a lot of young people at UF who were either going into or in ROTC, right? They're becoming officers. But I also talked to a lot of veterans who have come from Afghanistan and Iraq and now even Syria. The experiences they have are just as horrific. I mean, we're talking about people who are being ordered to torture people in Afghanistan and in Iraq and are agonized. And their entire lives have to live with this. And there's no one really who wants to talk with them because, as Doug and Scott alluded to, once you get beyond the, I was a veteran, I was a fighter, you can even get some cachet out of being a victim to a certain extent. But once you come out against the war, all hell breaks loose. I mean, one of the documents we have in Veterans for Peace is written by Smedley Butler, War is a Racket. Here's a person who received 2 Congressional Medals of Honor. And after he gets out, he said, I was a hired gun for who? The banks of Wall Street, exactly. And I found out years later, I mean, my gosh, I was in some of the exact same places this guy was in. It was stunning to me. But when he came out against the war, the whole society arrayed against him and accused him of being a traitor and all this stuff. But I think that we have to think about class and race and the so-called volunteer army right now. Is it really that much of a volunteer army? Yeah, if you go to ROTC, sure, but even there, I know a lot of ROTC students who are like, this is the way I have to pay for college. I don't have a trust fund. I don't have an inheritance.
It's economics.
It's economics,
Doug
exactly.
has something to say.
Yeah, just to kind of explain it, at least, and I got out in 2015, and I don't think stuff's changed in 3.5 years, and I'm sure from what you were saying it was the same back then, but now there's almost self-imposed segregation in the branch, at least in the Army. African American students generally do administrative jobs because a lot of people are, if you're joining the Army, your life probably isn't going great. And for me, the African Americans served with were supply, admin, personnel. They wanted a transferable skill that they could join the Army and get out. Hispanic soldiers were mechanics and, working and they wanted a transferable skill. They could go back home and help their family. They could help their dad at their shop. They could go back, usually in southwestern states, and go back home and have a transferable skill. Maybe go to college with GI Bill. White students were usually from, smaller communities, very conservative families, and they just were dirt poor and wanted something else, and a lot of times were pretty racist. And that's, from the sounds of what you've said, Paul, that's kind of held over from like the 70s and 80s and 90s.
White soldiers, you mean?
White soldiers.
What role did they?
White soldiers were MP, scouts, infantry.
So the grunts and the.
Yeah.
Wow, Doug, that's really interesting. Thank you. Wow.
Does everybody get money enough for a college education or?
No, that's the thing. When I was in between the old GI Bill and the new GI Bill. We have what we call the Veterans Educational Assistance Program. So you would put in a certain amount, the government would match that. If you went into combat MOS, you got a bonus. That's what I did. Now, but there were educational officers. Each unit had a so-called educational officer, usually a company grade officer, like a captain or first lieutenant. Their job was, as you're leaving the Army, is to say, hey, college isn't for everyone. And I will cut you a check back then for $7,000, or you can go to school and really struggle and maybe you'll drop out, but what do you want the check right now? And then we'll give you a re-enlistment bonus.
And this is when the Ford Ranger first came out. We called Ford Rangers re-up trucks because we could tell what had happened. Because the guy would come back from visiting the educational officer, and if he had a Ford Ranger, it meant he had re-upped and got that check but lost $15,000 to Uncle Sam. And I grew up hating officers. I hate to say this is a terrible prejudice I do have. I'm an NCO, raised by an NCO, was raised by an NCO, but that even made it even worse. I'm like, why would these guys do this? And again, class, as Doug pointed out, class is really critical, and race in the military to this day.
I can give some clarification on the system now.
Okay, so
there's the post 9/11 GI Bill, and it pays for 36 months, which ends up being 4 years of college and bachelor's. Outright, they give you a stipend each month based on your location. They pay your tuition, they give you $1,000 a year for books. But one of the things that's happened with post 9/11 GI Bill is they also allow trade schools. So now there's a predatory practice where trucking companies come, UTI comes, and they're like, you can come to us, and in 6 months you'll have a job. So people spend, $36,000 or $40,000 of their GI Bill and wipe it out to learn how to be a mechanic or something, which they could have done without.
Would it pay for University of Florida?
Yes, if you can get into college, it pays for your tuition.
So the GI Bill that I had was a great GI Bill. It paid for all of my school, my AA degree, my bachelor's degree, and then when I graduated from UF, I wrote a letter to the VA and I told them I couldn't get a job with a bachelor's degree in philosophy. And I wanted
They were so sympathetic, so sympathetic.
And I wanted vocational training, so I got my commercial pilot's license through the VA. So they really helped me. They were great for my.
Was that still part of what had been the World War II GI Bill, or had it been subsequent?
I can't tell you that.
It had been tinkered with a little bit, but it was still substantively the same. It really changed during the Reagan era.
As everything else.
Yeah, and there was a downsizing, we'll call it, of that, and that was my era.
Yeah.
One other thing I'd add is if you have to have an honorable discharge to even use it. If you've served 8 or 9 years and you've been perfect, and then you get punitive action taken against you in your last 2 or 3 months, and they kick you out, you lose all of it.
So is that just like if you've served in a war zone or combat, or that's everybody?
Everybody that joins that serves for at least 36 months active duty.
Isn't that torture he mentioned still going on by 2015?
I think this is their panel. I'll talk about it.
Last question. Heath mentioned torture, some of the stuff we'll talk about. I just wondered if that was way back when the Abu Ghraib only, which was what, 2012 or something?
Abu Ghraib was 2006.
Okay, so it must have continued at some degree.
It did. I mean, that's why I love this exhibit, Mac, is because you point out, there's a reason we should focus on the My Lai massacre this weekend, and we should continue to think about it and study it and learn from it. But at the same time, as both Mac and Scott pointed out, if you look at just the American War in Vietnam, there are many, many, many other atrocities. War is the atrocity. That's what we believe in Veterans for Peace. Not everyone believes that, but that's what we believe. And then what's happened now is, Abu Ghraib, that's important to focus on, to learn from, to study. But at the same time, war itself is the ongoing atrocity. Being in a town that's shelled, it's hard for me to explain to people. When I was in Central America, I was in areas that had been shelled, hit by artillery or airstrikes. That's something you can't recover from. Watching the footage last night of towns being burned to the ground, you can't put that back together again. All you can do is just kind of rebuild. And that's what we're continuously involved in Afghanistan and in Iraq, threatening Venezuela. And I just had, I've got correspondence from friends in Colombia asking me, one of them pointedly saying, don't Americans understand that when Americans talk about changing a system in another country, that people are going to have to pay a price, but it's not going to be the Americans? Mm-hmm. I said, that's what we're trying to do, Veterans for Peace, cost of war. When we do the Memorial Mile event, it's not like we're saying that the only people that suffered are these veterans, and we have the tombstones and people focus on that. We also try to point out the cost of war to everyone, to the families left behind,
yes, the veterans themselves, active duty military, but here's the reality of modern war. From now till the end of civilization, 75% of casualties in any war zone are going to be civilians. Because technology is developed to an extent that people in combat now are protected to an extent that they were not during the Civil War or even World War II. Michael Hurt talks about in dispatches, these World War II correspondents would be like, hey, we would lose more Marines in one day in Guadalcanal than an entire country in Vietnam in a month. But that's the war now. The wars are primarily going to impact, in a negative way, civilians.
That's what the book Dirty Wars.
Well, I mean, there are the transaction costs, the actual cost to a society in terms of what money spent on war. I mean, how much is spent now? The defense budget is up to what exactly? How much is off budget for the war? So it's the whole transaction costs. There are the human tolls, there's the environmental tolls, but there's also the impacts on the society. Money spent for war and the war machine that's not spent on social well-being.
Exactly. Well, I think we should kind of wrap it up at this point, but again, just a few reminders. And I do want to see if we can get some final thoughts from Mac and Scott. We have the exhibit running all the way to Sunday at what time?
4 o'clock.
So 4 p.m. 2 p.m. tomorrow, Cost of War panel featuring Mary Barr and some really cool people. And then also, again, we want to encourage folks, if you're not a member of Veterans for Peace, please consider joining us. We have a lot of literature. We have T-shirts. Any money we get, we use to support really cool things like Memorial Mile, like the Peace Poetry Contest.
Peace Scholarship.
Peace Scholarship. We're giving 3 $750 college scholarships. The deadline for that is April 15th. So if you're interested, talk to me. But final thoughts, Mac.
First of all, thank you so much for hosting the exhibit. I had started this, was sort of almost a pipe dream, and I sort of put it out there, I was going to do this exhibit, and I got a phone call from a guy with a very distinctive voice I thought I knew from somewhere, and it was Scott, and he said, what's your address? We're going to send you $500. He said, what? He said, we're at the end of the year, we got $500 left over, but you just have to bring the exhibit down when you're ready. And it was an incredible boost at that time. It was the first money we really got from a Veterans for Peace chapter. Anyway, it's been wonderful. I feel like I know so many of you personally now. We've had great conversations together. And Scott, thank you for making this happen in terms of your end. And thank all of you for welcoming me here and getting people to come into this exhibit. It's been really special and wonderful. And I've been hanging out with Sherry and Scott and living in their commune, and it's been just really ideal and wonderful. So thank you.
So, we live in a really good community here in Alachua County. The reason I was able to bring Mac here is because of all the community support that we have that gives us the money to do that. So we have the winter solstice concert every year. This year will be our 33rd annual concert, and we usually raise about $17,000. And we give about $8,000 of that to community organizations that we support, and then the rest we use for our programs. So we have coming up the Peace Poetry Contest. Do you want to say something about that, Sheila?
No, it's okay, everybody knows, there's flyers out there.
Okay, so we have and that's May 4th?
Yes, if anybody has K through 12, child, grandchild, friend, they should submit a peace poem. We had last year, I felt was the most intense poem because a lot of kids, it's peace and social justice, talked about just violence at school, being afraid to go to school, and it was super powerful. The younger kids, peace to them is nature, and that's beautiful, and Scott and Sherry were able to share those with Sierra Club members. So, the Peace Scholarship, please get people to apply.
It's all on the website.
Yes,
Go on
it
there.
really does.
VFPGainesville.org. So if you want to.
April 5th is the Civic Media Center Springboard, and we'll be doing the Penrod Award, which is one of the things that we do. Again, I'm really thankful to our community. We have such strong support here, and I'm really thankful for the Matheson Center allowing us to use this venue. And the Matheson Center is so supportive of us that they're not charging us to use this. So a big thank you to the Matheson Center. See all of you tomorrow at 2. The display is still open, and on tomorrow's panel, we're going to have Patience Mason, who wrote the book Recovering from the War. Her husband, Bob Mason, wrote Chicken Hawk, and she's going to be talking about PTSD. Mary Barr is going to be on that panel, and she's going to be talking some about Hugh Thompson and some about the what we could do with the money that we spend on war. And then Richard Hutchins will be on the panel, and he worked for the VA for 30 years helping us get our benefits. And he's going to talk about the numbers, how many veterans there are, how much money we spent, what it cost. So all of that's going to be tomorrow. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. I love some of the things you figured out here about Eisenhower and the dispatches going. Oh yeah. This is great the way you did this with sort of a series of quotes.